Good afternoon. Welcome to the fall season of virtual discussions at the American Philosophical Society. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming here at the APS. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with T. Cole Jones and his new book, Captives of Liberty, Prisoners of War, and the Politics of Vengeance in the American Revolution, which is now out from the University of Pennsylvania Press. I am glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. I do hope you'll check out our website, amphilsoc.org, and we're going to put that in the chat, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Today's webinar is part of the Society's David Center for the American Revolution program, and it's in fact our first program for the 2021-2022 year. The David Center is a collaboration between the David Library of the American Revolution and the APS, and it's dedicated to supporting scholarship on the American Revolution. The David Library's founder, Saul Feinstone, believed that the examination of the Founding Fathers' values and the events of the Revolutionary period were essential to creating an informed citizenry able to comprehend and adapt those founding principles to the ever-evolving circumstances of American society. The Center champions the active engagement of scholars, educators, and the general public of all ages in a continuing and dynamic encounter with this most central episode in the creation of the American nation. In addition to today's event, the David Center will also be hosting a week-long conference on meanings of independence, which will be held both in person and online on October 18th through 22nd. And I do hope everybody watching today will join us for that. This conference, as you might expect, anticipates the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and it will bring together those who have an interest in the revolution and its commemoration just 5 short years away in 2026. The conference is open to the public and it's completely free to attend. Please visit the APS website to register and to view a full schedule of the conference. And again, we'll put the link to take you directly to the conference page in the chat. For old friends joining us again, as we've done for the last 18 months, we are on Zoom webinar. For new friends joining us for the first time, don't worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, we're going to be using the Q&A button today. You might want to just locate that now. It's right down there on the bottom of your navigation bar. Ask a question at any time. We've left ample time at the end for a conversation with our speaker. We're also very happy and pleased to continue to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use the closed captioning during the panel, please click on the CC box. Again, that's going to be on the bottom navigation bar of your Zoom panel. It is to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, the reason you're all here today, please let me introduce today's speaker. T. Cole Jones is Associate Professor of History at Purdue University and holds a PhD in Early American History from Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in colonial and revolutionary America, the Atlantic world, the cultural history of violence, and war and society. In addition to Captives of Liberty, Jones has published articles in the New England Quarterly, the Journal of the Early Republic, the Journal of Military History, and Commonplace. His research has been supported by numerous institutions and foundations, including the American Antiquarian Society, the NEH, the Guggenheim, the United States Army Center of Military History, and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Captives of Liberty is now out and available for your purchase. The press that has published it has generously offered a 40% discount on the book for attendees today, as well as free shipping. I think if you calculate, that's probably better than Amazon. So do take advantage of it. Information will be in the chat. Cole is also currently at work on 2 new books, Loyalist Rising, the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, which is under contract with Westholme Press, as well as a study of the Western theater of the American Revolutionary War, provisionally titled Patrick Henry's War, The Struggle for Empire in the Revolutionary West. Thank you so much, Cole, for being with us today. I'll hand it over to you. You're muted, Cole. Sorry.
There I go. I'm unmuted. Okay, we'll restart. Thanks, Kyle. Yes, I was just saying thank you so much for coming today. Thank you to Adriana Link for inviting me to share this story with you. It means a lot because I began my research into this issue at the old David Library of the American Revolution in Washington's Crossing, and I actually had the privilege of giving a version of this talk at the final seminar at that location. So to see the David Library living on in the APS means a lot to me. So I'm really thankful to be here. That dissertation, which I wrote a long time ago now, eventually became this book, the one you're all here to hear about, and which was released in 2019. So what is this book about? In short, I asked the question, how did Americans treat their prisoners of war during the American Revolutionary War? And by prisoners of war, I define that term capaciously, not just British soldiers and sailors, but also Hessian auxiliaries and auxiliaries from other German provinces, Native American allies, American loyalists, both those in arms with the British Army and civilians as well. And as I was writing this, I sort of began with the premise that prisoners of war are problematic. They pose a number of perennial problems throughout the history of war. What do you do when your opponent stops fighting, begs for their lives, says, "Don't kill me"? Do you even take that person as a prisoner, or are they entitled to their life in any way? Surrendering enemy combatants present a whole host of these problems. Are your enemies entitled to their lives, right? Can you just kill them? If you do accept their surrender, what then? Do these people become your property? Do you have a right to enslave them? Who's going to provide for them once they're captured and in your hands? Who's going to feed them, give them new clothes, shelter, guard them, etc.? Where are you going to hold these people and for how long, right? Are you going to release them? Or are you going to keep them indefinitely? It's, in short, a logistical nightmare. And these questions become even more challenging when two opposing sides in a conflict do not acknowledge the common humanity between them, right? If you do not see your opponent as an equal, a peer, and if you see them as outside or different or outside of what you believe to be the civilized world, that can lead to even more problems, right? What if you see them as criminals, maybe even terrorists? And we saw this most recently, of course, during the war on terror. What do you do with Al-Qaeda operatives who are captured? What do you do with members of the Taliban? Are these combatants, lawful combatants under the rules of war? Or are these traitors? Are they terrorists, criminals to be prosecuted? Well, then are they entitled to the protections of the U.S. legal code? They're sort of in this limbo space where you can hold these people, but you don't really know what to do with them. And this is a real issue in independence movements, separatist movements. What do you do with prisoners who are trying to declare their independence from their government? They're rebelling against their government. Are they traitors? Are they freedom fighters? Are they criminals and rebels? Or are they patriots and founding fathers? And so you can see where I'm going with this. In short, my book asks, what would the founders do, right? What would these guys that we lionize today as the founders of the United States, how would they deal with these problems of prisoner treatment? And over the course of the 8 years of the Revolutionary War, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind, is that this conflict lasted 8 years, twice the length of the American Civil War. During the course of this 8 years, over 17,000 British and Allied prisoners fall into American hands during that conflict. And that's a conservative estimate. The number is probably almost certainly much higher than that. So what are they going to do with these people? In order to answer that question, however, I couldn't just jump in at Lexington and Concord and start telling the story. I had to take a step back. And not only did I have to take a step back, I had to take a step across the Atlantic Ocean, back to Europe, to look at warfare, the practice of war fighting during the age of the Enlightenment. And I've used this image to represent that. This painting was actually done in the late 19th century, but I think it captures the sort of color and spirit of what historians call the age of limited war, the age of small wars, right? So we see here the French army in the foreground. They are literally asking the British army if they would like the honor of firing first. Can you imagine asking your opponents, gentlemen, would you like to have the first go at this? It's a sort of chivalric picture of war, and one that is exaggerated, certainly in this image, but bears a lot of truth, right? This was, in fact, the age of the Enlightenment, when European intellectuals, scholars, and elites began to believe that reason, the human capacity for reason, could constrain violence. And we need to put this in the context of the religious wars of the 17th century, in particular the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, so a century before this conflict here, where Protestants and Catholics hacked each other to death over the idea of salvation, whose path to salvation was right. Towns were besieged and laid bare, women and children butchered and murdered. It was a devastating, devastating conflict. And so by the 18th century, people began to believe, actually, no, violence can be controlled. It's still necessary, right? Violence is still a part of politics. It is still a tool within a politician's toolbox to solve problems. And sometimes it's requisite. You have to use violence, but it can be controlled. It can be limited. It can be restrained. It can be used on the battlefield against the regular forces of your opponent's nation state, and that there are certain rules that amounts to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in warfare. And by the mid-18th century, these rules become codified as what Europeans would have called the laws of nations, that nations have laws. This is sort of like the origins of international relations, as you will, that there's a sort of common code book that European nations will follow. Now, of course, there's no Geneva Convention. There's no UN to sanction foreign powers in breach of these rules of war. And in fact, what I'm describing here is really an idealized vision of what war looked like. On the ground, it was a lot messier in practice, but nonetheless, there's a lot of truth to this. And prisoners of war play a really big role in this process, because prisoners of war become kind of a currency in European warfare, a currency that can be exchanged, right? So if I capture a bunch of your soldiers in battle, it does me no good to murder them. It does me no good to enslave them. They're worth far more to me as a negotiating tool with my opponent, to exchange them for my own soldiers in their hands, as a way of gaining credibility, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this, the sort of reciprocal nature of prisoner treatment is undergirded by a culture, the European culture of honor, which is a very elite-driven, aristocratic culture in this period. European aristocrats would not have believed the common man capable of honorable behavior, but if you were a man of birth, a man of the gentry or the aristocracy, honor was everything. And I think this painting here really captures that. This painting done by the American Benjamin West of an event within the European theater of the American Revolutionary War. A British officer engaged in some convivial conversation with a Spanish officer that he has just captured, right? So this Spaniard has been captured during the siege of Gibraltar, and these two men are sharing a moment. They're commemorating this by a fancy painting of that sort of pan-European aristocratic culture of war, right? Where we as gentlemen respect each other. I have accepted the Spanish officer's parole, from the French meaning word, parole, his word of honor, not to try and escape until he's equitably exchanged. And so the humane treatment of prisoners of war in 18th century European warfare is predicated upon this divide between the aristocratic culture, the officers, the gentlemen, and common soldiers. But nonetheless, even common soldiers have great value. It does you no good to abuse them. In fact, you want to get them exchanged as quickly as possible. So the beginning of a conflict in European warfare, let's just take the 7 Years' War as an example. The opposing belligerent parties would sign what's known as a cartel. And a cartel is effectively a treaty specifying how prisoners are to be treated and how they're to be exchanged, most importantly. The cartel signed between Britain and France specified that prisoners should only be held for a maximum of 2 weeks before they can be exchanged and returned to their own side. Most importantly, it is the responsibility of your own army to provide for you while you're in enemy custody. So this Spanish officer is going to receive money from the Spanish crown to pay for himself. He's not going to be, or to at least reimburse the British for his own captivity. And so that there are, of course, great exceptions to this rule and breaches of behavior. But nonetheless, this sort of rule of how you treat prisoners of war was highly effective. And it was effective not just because of this culture of honor that I've described, but also because of the principle of reciprocity. If this British officer were to mistreat this Spanish officer, right, to deprive him of his liberty, put him in shackles or in a jail, the Spaniards are going to do the exact same thing in proportion to a British officer in their own custody. And this they called the law of retaliation, an equal but opposite reprisal for any breach of these laws of war. And so that is sort of the stick. If the culture of honor is the carrot that keeps this war together, this style of war together, then the principle of retaliation, the law of retaliation, is the stick. So in effect, warfare was actually much more contained, much more restrained, much less violent in the 18th century than it had been in the preceding century, or than it would be in the following century, following the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon. So it really is different. What about war in America, you say, right? Isn't this a book about the American Revolution? Well, of course, war in America is going to be different. For the large part, for most of colonial American history, professional or standing armies, regular armies from nation states are not going to be engaged in conflict in North America. It's going to be primarily fought by citizen militias, local militias, provincial forces, and of course, Native Americans. And Native Americans had their own ideas about how war should be conducted. What constitutes legitimate violence, such as taking the scalp of a wounded enemy soldier, such as this guy here. That's considered legitimate violence, but other forms of violence that Europeans might use, such as burning villages, would have been considered illegitimate. So I sort of, and one historian has called this a clash of cultures of war, two different ideas about how war should be conducted. And so consequently, war in America looks very different than it did in Europe. But nonetheless, as this painting shows, Anglo-American elites, the sort of leaders of these colonies and their military forces, tried to emulate the European practices of war. They thought of themselves as British. It's one of the great ironies of the American Revolution that Americans were really never more British than they were at the beginning of the Revolution, right? In 1775, these are people fighting for their British liberties, who think of themselves as British people. And so Sir William Johnson here, who is a sort of Anglo-Irish colonial from New York, has himself depicted not as the conqueror on a great horse, on a white horse, but instead as a man of humanity. He would have described himself as a man of humanity, restraining his, quote, savage Mohawk ally from murdering and scalping this French officer who's part of that same sort of pan-European aristocratic culture. And so he's going to try and shield this French officer and take great pride in that, so much pride that he has his painting done that way. So when war breaks out between the 13 mainland or East Coast colonies from Georgia to Massachusetts and the mother country, Great Britain, in April of 1775, the leaders of the protest movement, people we call patriots or revolutionaries, or the people who will become the founding fathers, these people had a very clear idea of what war was going to look like. It wasn't going to look like this painting with, indigenous war parties ranging on the frontier. No, they were going to conduct this conflict according to the rules, the European rule book, and they expected the British to do just the same. Unfortunately, for prisoners on both sides, the British had very different ideas. To the British, these rebellious colonists, ungrateful colonists, were traitors. Right? They had defied supremacy of Parliament, which is the bedrock of the English Constitution. They had defied their king. They had fired on the king's troops, killed some of the king's troops. They were in an open state of rebellion. In 18th century Britain, rebellion is not new. The British Army, in fact, spent most of the 18th century suppressing rebellions in Ireland, in Scotland, a bunch, but also in the West Indian Islands and elsewhere. So the British Army is really good at suppressing rebellion. And rebellion has its own asterisks in the rules of war. If you read the book, in cases of rebellion, right? They're outside of the law. This isn't a nation or kingdom. These are not professional or standing regular troops. So the rules are a bit different. So for the British, these Americans are rebels. They need to be chastised and they need to be punished as they had punished other rebels in Scotland, etc. Moreover, you can't sign a cartel with a pack of rebels. You can't sign a treaty with them because suddenly what are you doing if you're so doing? You're acknowledging the legitimacy of a movement that you have declared illegitimate. So the whole point of suppressing a rebellion is that you deny the legitimacy of that rebellion. So you can't negotiate with terrorists effectively. We saw this caused President Obama some problems, and even President Trump when he tried to negotiate with the Taliban, right? Is this a terrorist group or is this a legitimate military force or government that you can negotiate with? It's a very tricky issue. But they also can't just execute everyone. The British Army can't just plow through Massachusetts countryside, arrest people, and hang them. Why? Well, first of all, there are probably not enough trees to hang the population. There's certainly not enough troops to catch everyone and hang them all. But moreover, the strategic goal of the British Army is not to kill a bunch of colonists and crush them, but is in fact to win their hearts and minds. And Sir Henry Clinton, one of the commanders of the British Army, actually uses that phrase, right? This is our job, is to win the hearts and minds of our American subjects and bring them back into the imperial fold. So if you're going around executing people left and right, that's not a good way to do that. It's going to tick some people off. So consequently, when the British capture prisoners, they exist in this sort of liminal state, right? They're neither legitimate combatants, nor are they criminals. We don't have enough courts to try them all. Where are they? They're going to sort of be in between. And unfortunately for these prisoners, that means most of them, or very many of them at least, are going to spend some time on one of these, a prison hulk. It's an old warship, decommissioned warship anchored off of the British headquarters in New York Harbor, in what is now Brooklyn Harbor. This idea had existed before, right? Prison hulks had been used. This is not some new example of British sadism. The French had used them in the 7 Years' War, et cetera. But it's meant to be a temporary expedient. It's a place where you don't have land-based prisons. Remember, the British are occupying cities. They don't control the countryside. They don't have a lot of space. There are no prisons to put them in. So what are you going to do? Well, we can put them on these ships until we can exchange them, right? 2 weeks, right, is what the cartel should have said. But there is no cartel. Right, so they can't negotiate with Congress until 1782. Rather, I think it's March of 1782. The British Parliament refuses to allow their military officers to negotiate with Congress on an official standing. So they can't negotiate with terrorists. So this is a problem. These guys start backing up. Right, these ships become overcrowded. And remember what I said before about the tradition in European warfare, that you were responsible for paying for your own soldiers and sailors in enemy custody, not the other way around. So in theory, the Americans on the Jersey and other prison ships are meant to be supplied by the revolutionaries. So Congress has to foot that bill and reimburse the British at the very least. Problem: Congress is not a legislative body. It's more like a diplomatic assembly between 13 separate, disparate polities. And consequently, Congress does not have the right to tax. Congress cannot tax its constituents. It can only raise money by borrowing. It has to supply Washington's army. And as we know, It doesn't do that very well, right? The story of the bloody footprints at Valley Forge were down to us to this day. And so consequently, there's no money. And so these guys are put on half rations in really terrible, cramped conditions, and they begin to die. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30,000 Americans were captured during the war, which is a lot. And of them, more than 50% died. Somewhere between 12,000 on the low end and 18,000 on the high end. But either way, it's more than a sort of 50% mortality rate. And that is shockingly high, 50% mortality rate if you're captured. So how are the Americans going to respond? I think we respond to this, quote, provocation, right? Well, the first thing the revolutionary leaders realize is this is good for us. This is showing that the British are bad, and we're the ones that are humane and merciful and playing by the rules. So we're the true civilized people, and they're the barbarians. So they use these stories for propagandistic purposes, along with stories of Native Americans and enslaved Africans in arms, to really frighten the neutral people, which is probably pretty close to a third of the population, or people who are sort of on the fence, right? Where do I want to go? I'm not sure. I just want to be left out of this. Well, suddenly, if your brother has been captured and he died of smallpox on the Jersey, you're going to change your mind. And these people really do. So in effect, this idea of propagating these stories of British atrocities actually serves to undermine the leadership of the American Army and Congress's point. Right? They want to say, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. As one American officer says, General Washington intends to show the British that Americans are humane as well as brave. Right? We are humane as well as brave. But it kind of backfires because ordinary people are like, well, if they can do this to us, why are we not doing this to them? Right? Why are we not revenging ourselves on them? And American people really become incensed over this, petitioning Congress, particularly petitioning their state legislatures to, in the words of one enraged citizen, revenge the innocent blood of your murdered children. Right? The time had come. Like, we've turned the other cheek long enough, and it's time to fight fire with fire. And because the authority of these revolutionary governments derived from the consent of the people and the principle of popular sovereignty, right? This is where they're claiming their legitimacy, is because the people support us. They have to listen. They have to listen to their constituents, and in particular, these individual state legislatures become swayed into engaging in what I call the politics of vengeance, right? That we have to revenge ourselves on them. So who are they going to revenge themselves on? Those closest to hand. It would be very difficult to revenge yourself on William Howe while he's snug in bed in Philadelphia. But your neighbor, who you know to be a loyalist, is much closer to hand. And so after the 4th of July, 1776, all 13 former colonies, now independent states, will declare loyalism as treason. If you believe in the government under which you were born, you're a traitor to your new government. If you take up arms or supply the British Army with supplies, then you are suddenly a rebel in arms and you can be executed on the spot. And many are. Additionally, most states will put loyalists on trial, especially prominent loyalists. Several of them will execute them. But legal execution is actually comparatively rare. What's much, much more common is for individual committees of safety or individual militia groups to revenge themselves on loyalists extra legally, so outside of the bounds of law. 5 of the 13 colonies will now states. 5 of the 13 states will actually create their own prison ships. Now, they don't need these prison ships because they actually have jails in their community that they can hold people in. They are doing them specifically for the purposes of revenge. And these ships are called things like the Reprisal, the Revenger, things like that. And they are confining these loyalists on these ships. Connecticut is going to convert an abandoned lead mine into a prison where people are actually lowered down into the bowels of this lead mine, and it's effectively a death trap for these prisoners. Additionally, ordinary people are just going to take matters into their own hands and engage in vengeance. A Virginian by the name of Charles Lynch, who commanded a sort of militia group in the Virginia backcountry, was so infamous for executing loyalists under what he called Lynch's law, right? So no legal standing. He doesn't have orders from Virginia to do this. Virginia government. He's just doing it on his own authority. That the act of hanging a loyalist became known as lynching. And you can see the reverberations of that down through American history. Loyalists, for their part, are not innocent victims, right? They are going to respond in kind and engage in their own armed insurrections. They're going to engage in torture of Whig or rebel sympathizers, etc. But it's not enough for these enraged Americans to revenge themselves on a handful of loyalists. The British must also pay, because the British are the ones who are really orchestrating this whole prison industrial complex in New York Harbor, where all these people are dying. And the American people will get the opportunity for revenge on a grand scale in October of 1777, when an American army under the command of Major General Horatio Gates captures a major British army under the command of Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. This, of course, is the famous surrender at Saratoga. Here we see Gates in the center and John Burgoyne surrendering his sword. This is the first major example of a surrender. Washington had captured a brigade of Hessian auxiliaries at Trenton at Christmas of 1776, and those prisoners have been treated very well. What are we going to do now with 5,000 plus British and Germanic prisoners? What are we going to do? Well, Gates had actually known Burgoyne since they were children. They joined the 20th Regiment of Foot, I believe it is, together as ensigns. They'd served together. They're old friends. And Gates basically lets Burgoyne go. Instead of demanding an unconditional surrender, he engages in what's known as a convention. And a convention is a negotiated cessation of hostilities between two belligerent powers, but it doesn't necessarily imply a surrender. So under the terms of the convention, Burgoyne and his entire army are not prisoners of war. They are, in fact, under the protection of this convention until they can get back to England. Once they get back to England, the British government is bound by this convention to release a certain number or an equal number of American prisoners, maybe some of those guys in New York City. That at least is the idea. So Americans are thrilled by this great victory, right? We finally won one. A major British army are our prisoners. Oh, but they're not. They're not our prisoners. In fact, they're going back to England. And when they go back to England, thousands of fresh British troops who are garrisoning Scotland or Ireland are going to come over in their place. And that's going to be a real problem. And so ordinary Americans are going to begin petitioning Congress saying, no, you cannot do this. We must use Burgoyne's army as an example. We must retaliate upon them to convince the British to behave, or at least that's what they say. So in January of 1778, Congress is going to effectively annul the Convention of Saratoga, consigning these men to captivity for the remainder of the war. But the problem is, since they're not supposed to be prisoners, the British say, well, we're not going to pay for them because you are holding them in violation of the treaty, so we're not going to pay. Uh-oh. Well, now Congress can't pay. The prisoners are stuck in Boston. The people of Massachusetts have run out of money for them. They're tired of supplying them. Congress has to do something. So Congress is going to march these men in the dead of winter all the way to Albemarle, Virginia, near Charlottesville, Virginia, where they will be interned. This is a brutal march. Men are falling sick. They're undersupplied. Once they get there, there are no barracks for them. Disease is going to run rampant. There's not enough food. Malnutrition is going to take effect. As a British surgeon in one of the prison camps notes, he says, the prisoners are falling sick so fast that there are not men enough to attend the sick or to bury the dead. In his opinion, the entire army was at the very jaws of death. And these prisoners will be moved again. Once Virginia can no longer supply them, they'll be moved to Maryland and then later Pennsylvania. These are the men of the Convention Army marching off to captivity. And so we can track their whereabouts of which regiment was where. Some are sent to Fort Frederick in Maryland. Others are confined in prison. Others are basically indentured, sent out to work for local farmers as a way of basically feeding themselves, because while others are sick in hospital or are dying and dead. So it's a real tragic story. As one British escapee who made it back to British lines, he reported the prisoners died 3 to 4 a day. They're held for over 5.5 years, and fewer than 20% of them will actually make it home. That doesn't mean that 80% of them died. Very many of these people actually end up escaping, blending in to the environment. Some become American citizens after the war. Others make it back to British lines. But nonetheless, this is a real tragic story, and one that embarrasses George Washington tremendously. George Washington sees himself as the epitome of the European way of war, that he is a gentleman officer, and Gates had pledged his word and Congress had broken their word. It's not a very dishonorable thing. Luckily for Washington, he gets the opportunity to perform that gentlemanly European culture of war in October of 1781, when with the help of the French army and navy, he captures another major British army, this time the army of Lord Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown. And here he makes it very clear. We're not going to do a convention, right? Because that didn't play. What we're going to do is a capitulation. So you will surrender and your men will be prisoners of war. But in the terms of the surrender, I will guarantee that your men will be given equal rations, food as the Continental Army. They will await exchange, and we will try to exchange them as expeditiously as possible. The officers, for the most part, can go on their parole, either back to New York or back to England. Cornwallis will just go straight back to England. And most importantly, I have a proviso in this surrender document that says your men can never be used for the purpose of retaliation. We'll never allow your men to be retaliated upon under any reasons for that. So Washington's feeling very good for himself. But as it turns out, Congress still cannot tax, and the individual states are still infuriated and not desirous of paying for these men. And so these men are going to fall in the same sort of trap as the Convention Army. Thankfully for them, they're held for a shorter period of time, only a year and a half before the war is over. But that year and a half is a dark time indeed. These men are marched into the interior of Virginia, Maryland, and then Pennsylvania. A succession of prison camps where they are terribly supplied, where disease run rampant. Pennsylvania is particularly bad because of yellow fever that summer, and they begin to die in droves. One survivor of these camps left a great memoir of his experience, but also this wonderful drawing of one of these camps that the Americans called Camp Security, because the men were locked inside this stockade fence. It was really a primitive thing. And he writes, he says, Lord Cornwallis's army was shut up here like a toad in a hole and as full of venom. So these men are seething at their treatment, which is really quite horrible. The British, however, at this particular moment, sort of changed their mind. Right, they're at war with France. They want to end this conflict, and so they began negotiating in earnest with Congress. In 1782, they say, yes, we will acknowledge your legitimacy as a legitimate power for the purpose of exchange. We would like to get rid of some of these guys in New York that we can't afford to feed and you're not paying for. Could we please have an exchange? And Congress says no. Holding the Convention Army, holding Cornwallis's army as captives for political reasons, both for revenge and to force the British to negotiate a cessation of hostilities, is too powerful. And so they let men on both sides die for the remainder of the war. And if you go through the accounts of these people who are in these camps, it's just absolutely devastating. And unfortunately, we don't have any photographs, obviously, from this period. It's before the age of photography. But this is what starvation, disease, neglect does to the human body. This is a Union prisoner of war upon his release from the notorious Andersonville prison. And Andersonville prison is a worthy note of comparison, because the mortality rate of these British prisoners from Cornwallis's army in American hands is actually slightly higher than that of the Union prisoners at Andersonville. It's well over 30%. So that's really shocking. The same is true, the brutal treatment for what happened to American prisoners aboard the Jersey prison ship and others. Here we see an image done by John Trumbull of what it might have looked like on board one of those prison hulks. One British survivor of the war, former prisoner, I think really summed up this experience for both sides. He said, the treatment of prisoners in general during the American War was harsh, severe, and in many instances, inhuman. Wow. That's a hard story, right? That's an ugly story. It's one we don't like to think about. But what can we make of that? What can we conclude from this story? How does this make us rethink the American Revolution? And for one, I think it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the American Revolution was tragic, much more tragic than our triumphalist narratives celebrating on the 4th of July would have us believe. It was a bloody, contradictory, divisive civil war, pitting brother against brother, families against families. Perhaps even more importantly, I think the story shows that the Americans' wartime commitment to the restraint of violence, right? We're going to follow the rules, we're going to behave humanely, was fragile. And the experience of the war itself degraded, eroded, and eventually erased those distinctions. And Americans were capable of incredible cruelty to other human beings. So in short, you guys can all help me. This is my goal. I want to stop talking about the war for independence. I hate this term. It's not a war for independence. Let's call it what it really was, which is the American Revolutionary War. This was a revolutionary war. It was fundamentally different than prior conflicts. In many ways, it was every bit as revolutionary as the French Revolutionary Wars. And while it didn't devolve into the guillotine in Philadelphia, it very easily could have. And every place that the British and their loyalist allies are actually able to pose a real threat to the revolutionary government, you get these cycles of vengeance and violence that are every bit as brutal as those you see in the French Revolutionary Wars. So from the vantage point of its prisoners, the prisoners of the revolution, the American Revolution actually looks like a cautionary tale, not an inspirational tale. And my book implores us today in the 21st century to emulate the aspirations of the revolutionaries, the aspirations of the founders, but not their actions. We must continue to celebrate the best of the American Revolution, but in order to do that, we must acknowledge the worst. And I think the attack on our nation's capital in January of 2020 shows that the specter of violent insurrection, overthrowing the government, even civil war, remains very much with us today. And so we must be vigilant. We must make sure that atrocities like I have just outlined for you never happen again. All right, thank you all very much. I look forward to your questions, and let's open up the discussion.
That was great. That was certainly a take no prisoners presentation, Cole. Thank you so much for that. Maybe you want to take your slides down, or do you want to up?
Yeah, sounds good. Let's just see. How do I need to actually just end it, don't I? And then I can stop share. There we go.
We've got a good 17 minutes for questions, and there's a bunch already in. So I encourage people to use the Q&A button to add more. I'm just going to jump right in here. Great presentation. So when you think about how you framed the European lack of inheritance, maybe, right, the contrast that you want to set up there. One of our audience members asked about the 30 Years' War. And asked with that, and using that as a point of contrast, do religion and nationality differences make for a different attitude towards taking prisoners? So maybe beyond the Enlightenment, right, how does religion and the sort of nascent nation state formation factoring in?
Well, it played a tremendous role in the period up to the one we're discussing today, right? In which, if you lived in a world in which God is the epicenter of your society, God creates all of society, right? God to the king, to the house, the aristocrats, all of society is ordered on a top-down way. The church is at the center of your life. You are working for your salvation. Then conflict over religion is incredibly important, right? And visceral. And that's going to lead to an othering of those people who disagree with you, which is why we see such virulence in the 30 Years' War between Protestant and Catholic forces, and the sacking of towns, and mass rapes and murdering of prisoners, etc. There's an image which I thought to show but then didn't, of a French artist called The Miseries of War, showing the Catholics hanging prisoners of war and trying to convert them with the cross, right as they're strangling to death right at the end, because that plays an incredibly important role. And religion doesn't go away, obviously, in the 18th century. The Enlightenment penetrates not as far as you might think, and it's going to play a huge role during the wars of the French Revolution, French revolutionaries jettisoning the Catholic Church and invading countries that are animated by the Catholic Church, in particular Spain. And so religion is going to be a unifying factor that leads to incredible atrocities in those conflicts. It plays less of a role here because they're all Protestant. They've all bought into this, the religious settlement of 1688 after the Glorious Revolution, where, yeah, maybe you're a Presbyterian and that's weird, and but you're still a Protestant. You're not Catholic, and so we can work with you there. So there's not that same othering process. Now, I talked about how the British Army opposed and suppressed rebellions around the empire. Most of those rebellions are happening where? On the Celtic fringe of the British Isles. So in Ireland, which is predominantly Catholic in this period, but also in the Scottish Highlands, where many of the population remain Catholic, or they are some of them are dissenting Presbyterians. And so religion and then culture, language, is going to exacerbate these othering differences. And so the British Army that's operating in the Highlands of Scotland in 1746 is going to commit way more atrocities than the British Army that's operating in the Pennsylvania countryside in 1777. So yes, religion is very important.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to now maybe put some of these questions together because there's so many. And I do want everyone to know that we will share with Dr. Jones all of the questions that are submitted after the talk. We preserve all of those. So you'll have a chance, to sort of reach out directly. So thinking about sort of othering in the American context, there's sort of two questions here. I'll ask the first one, let you answer, then go to the next one. So how did race shape the politics of vengeance? And this comes from Sean Gallagher, who's the David Center postdoctoral fellow here right now. He's thinking about what it meant for recaptured Black loyalists and how patriot rhetoric about British armed slaves drove certain fantasies of violence. Lynch in Virginia, for instance, also managed the Chiswell lead mines, which held Black soldiers captured at the Battle of Great Bridge. So how do they come into your analysis?
Yeah, so race is another really important factor. It's a dividing factor. These colonists, white British colonists, at the beginning of the American Revolution, see themselves as the freest people in the world, largely because they know what actual slavery looks like. They know, and to be Black is to be a slave more often than not in the colonial American consciousness, especially in the South, or places with Black majorities like South Carolina. So yes, absolutely. And the British incitement of domestic enemies, inciting domestic insurrections is what Thomas Jefferson calls it in the Declaration of Independence, is a direct reference to Lord Dunmore's proclamation in which he offers to arm slaves who will oppose their rebel masters. And this is early in the conflicts, the fall of 1775. And so the Americans are going to use this for propagandistic purposes. And Robert Parkinson has written a really smart book about how the revolutionaries use this language of othering, particularly African Americans, but also Native Americans, as a way of creating a common cause, right? Look, the British, they're the savages, they're the barbarians. They're arming our slaves. They're arming Native peoples to try and kill us. We have to resist them. And so, yes, from the very beginning, African Americans in arms are going to be treated very differently. When George Washington captures the brigade of Hessians at Trenton, these are almost all of them are German, are from the German states, and mostly Hesse-Kassel. But a number of slaves in the Jersey countryside had run away to the British because they had heard that the British means freedom. And these Hessians are like, sure, come on. And so many of them are actually serving under arms at Trenton when Washington captures them. And there's an auction that's held right after the battle. And the Hessian soldiers, the white soldiers, are put in one way, and the Black soldiers are auctioned on the spot. So that tells you right away that certain people are entitled to these protections of war and other people aren't. Other people are outside of the realm of civilized warfare. Applies again to Native Americans, who are very rare. I always get asked about Native American prisoners. Like, what do they do with Native American prisoners? It was like, it's almost a contradiction in terms. There's almost not a thing as Native American prisoners because the American Revolution just killed them. And it's really that horrific. And it's a story we don't tell enough.
You actually anticipated the second question, which was from Jennifer Anderson about that. how Native combatants figured among the prisoners and how they were treated differently from English or other clans.
Yeah, and so they actually the revolutionaries are always accusing the British of inciting Native Americans as these barbarian savages, as they call them. And so they actually use that to justify, for instance, General Sullivan's campaign against the Haudenosaunee people or the Iroquois Confederacy. That is a retaliation against the Iroquois. They only bring them to battle really once, the Battle of Newtown. Most of that campaign is actually burning villages, and crops in particular. So preventing them from feeding themselves and starving them out. And the revolutionaries used this language of extirpation. Right? We must extirpate and Washington actually says this. We must extirpate the Iroquois, which is not a thing you would think of. You wouldn't want to extirpate Parliament or the average person in Britain. So it's pretty tough stuff. And in fact, another thing I found that was rather interesting is when British soldiers and particularly usually this is Canadian militia, many oftentimes Franco-Canadian, when they're caught in native dress. So if they're not wearing their regimentals, their Western style clothing, if they're caught wearing native dress, they're treated as native peoples and they're killed or in some cases tortured because they have abandoned their civilization by dressing in that way. So your skin color wouldn't necessarily protect you.
A couple of questions in here about regionalism. And I think what's really fascinating about what you gave us was consistency, right? So 13 states all passed very similar legislation, yet we know this is a war that has many fronts and manifests itself in different ways. And so Cliff Lewis asked, how did retaliation theory play out, particularly in the Southern theater? And then scrolling down, I've got John McAndrew asked, the theater in Georgia doesn't get a lot of attention. It was the only colony where a royal government was reestablished during the war. How did the two sides there treat their prisoners?
Yeah, these are great questions. So one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is attack what I call a Southern exceptionalism in the Revolutionary War. For much of the literature of the Revolutionary War of the second half of the 20th century, it's portrayed the American War for Independence as this very sort of set piece, pretty thing that we can look at. But yeah, there were some atrocities in the South, right? And that's ugly, and maybe we don't want to talk about that. And then some people are like, well, actually, let's study that. Let's study the atrocities in the South. And in particular, Wayne Lee has done a lot of work about violence and atrocity in North Carolina, for instance. But there are other studies as well. And I think this becomes manifest, to the average American in that awful Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, right, which is in the South, and you see these cycles of vengeance and retaliation until Mel Gibson finally says, no, we're better than that. We won't execute prisoners anymore because I'm Mel Gibson, right? So it's almost like I describe it as a particularly violent coda to an otherwise restrained conflict. And actually, no, it's the exclamation point on a conflict that has escalated from day one. And it just so happens that the war is that's where the campaigns have moved by the end of the Revolutionary War. It's of course compounded by issues like slavery and the presence of slaves and the British Army freeing slaves, absolutely. But it is not exceptional. And in fact, anywhere that the British Army can project enough power to incite loyalist insurrection, you see this. So the Hudson River Valley is notorious for this. The Long Island Sound is notorious for this. The Bergen County and sort of northern New Jersey outside of British lines, notorious for this. The Chesapeake Bay. Anywhere where the British can establish authority for long enough that the loyalists think, okay, we're safe, we're protected, now we can revenge ourselves on our rebel oppressors, you see these cycles of retaliation and vengeance. A very good question. Oh, and Georgia. Yeah, poor Georgia. My parents are from Georgia, and Georgia doesn't get enough play in this, in large part because other than the siege of Savannah and the occupation of Savannah in 1779 by the British, most of the fighting there is again militia and these groups of raiding parties, usually with indigenous people as well. And you do see those same sort of cycles of vengeance there. Thomas Brown, who's a loyalist leader from Georgia, is notoriously tortured by revolutionaries. they burn his feet, which is an awful, painful way to be tortured. And then he comes back later in the revolution, and he gets his vengeance. He was famous for hanging people from stairwells, so along the banister, rebels, men, women, children, the whole thing. So yes, Georgia is a sort of middle ground, especially after the British come back. And again, this helps my model of where the British can establish authority for long enough to incite loyalist insurrection. You get this really virulent type of a war, what I call a war for vengeance.
That's great. I've got a great question here from Matt Mason, who is giving the second in our David Center seminar series, which happens once a month on Wednesday afternoons. And look on the website to learn more about that. He writes, what strikes me about the political debate surrounding the treatment of POWs and other related things is that the concept of humanity remains still very potent politically. For instance, British opponents of the war repeatedly used that concept to upbraid the government for its prosecution of the war. These ongoing expressions of fealty to the ideals of humanity in the political sphere seem to be in stark contrast with the realities that you are very vividly describing on the ground. What do we do with that contrast?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for it other than this language of humanity, what they call the laws of humanity or the rights of humanity, is an Enlightenment language that both sides speak. So I oftentimes think of the American Revolution as a big misunderstanding, and the revolutionaries are speaking a slightly different version of the same language. When they're talking about British liberty, they mean something different than what Parliament is saying, but they're using the same words. And that's the same thing, too, with this idea of the rights of humanity or the laws of humanity. And both sides employ that for political purposes. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the Americans are saying, you have violated the rights of humanity. In fact, Washington uses that language to accuse Thomas Gage very early on, right after Lexington and Concord, right? When does he take command in the summer? June of 1775 or July of 1775. He's writing Gage and saying, you are a violator of the rights of humanity, which makes you a barbarian and therefore uncivilized. Like, you are not behaving like a civilized person. Get in line. And Gage is like, but you are violating the rights of humanity because you're opposing your king. And most importantly, you're opposing your representative government, Parliament, and the supremacy of Parliament, which is what makes you free in the first place. So if you're attacking Parliament, you are by definition outside of the realm of humanity. You might as well be a Jacobite, right? You're attacking the very premise of what it means to be British. In this period. So they're sort of speaking past each other, and both sides use this politicized language. The revolutionaries will accuse the British of violating the rights of humanity for freeing slaves. Think about that, right? How is that a violation of the rights of humanity? The British will say, well, you're the slave owners, you're the ones that are violating humanity. Of course, while the British, are keeping slaves themselves throughout the West Indies and elsewhere. And I think there's a move right now. This is going off on a bit of a tangent, but there's a move right now to sort of portray the British as this emancipatory power, as like animated by the rights of humanity, and that they're going to spread freedom. The American Revolutionaries are the enslavers, and the British are the liberators. And that dichotomy, I think, is a false one that we would do well to not engage in, because the British, yes, they're freeing slaves, but they're doing so for very particular military reasons, because they can't project power. They don't have enough troops in these regions, and they need allies or auxiliaries to do so. They're not sitting there being like slavery is bad, and therefore the revolutionaries are bad. It's not at least not from the British perspective, what's going on. Anyway, I went off on a tangent, but yeah, very good point about the rights of. There's a really good book. I can't call her name right now. Amanda something about the laws of humanity. Came out with Oxford Press a few years ago.
Let me ask you one final question, which is self-serve for the APS because it's gesturing ahead to our conference in 2 weeks. So we are approaching 2026, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but I feel like the history you've shared with us today is not one that would have comfortably been presented in 1976. Are Americans ready to understand the revolution as a far more violent event? Personally, I was struck by your comparison to Guantanamo. Are historians thinking about the American Revolution in terms of terrorism? So I'm curious what you think we kind of need to think about as we head.
Yeah. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I don't want to prognosticate about the future. That's not what historians are equipped to do. But what I will say is that all historians look at the past through the lens of their own times. Right? That is what the process of historical revisionism that some people would accuse is, they're just revisionists and they don't love their history. No, every historian is shaped by the context in which he or she lives. And they're viewing the past through that lens. So in 1976, people see the revolution a very different way. The echoes of Vietnam are certainly at play there, and that's going to shape how the revolution is seen in the 80s and into the 90s. But yes, we'd be foolish to say that the age of these forever wars, which we may or may not be out of, shaped, and the war on terror shaped the way historians are viewing the revolutionary period. I'm not the only scholar that engaged in this type of work. Holger Hook came out with a book a few years ago that just looked at violence itself as a concept that had been largely erased from the literature. There are others. Wayne Lee's been doing this type of work for a long time. Robert Parkinson has this new blockbuster book, and others are coming. Woody Holton has a new book coming out that's going to emphasize this, Alan Taylor's American Revolution. So it's part of a historiographic shift that is, of course, because of the times in which we live. Now, will the general public accept that? It's a good question, right? So history so often is used for nationalistic purposes, right? To create a narrative of us against them. What does it mean to be American? And when you start snipping at the founders, people get very defensive. And on some level, that's understandable, but it's also the historian's job to nuance. It's a historian's job to show, in many ways, I think, to show that we can do better. This is how I sort of implored us at the end, is not to try to say, oh, like we're going to make America great again, right? Because we can't live up to the founders. It's like, well, actually, they were struggling too, and they were humans, and they had emotions, and they were animated by base emotions like vengeance, just like we are today. And so we can emulate some of their lofty rhetoric while also being more inclusive, while also understanding that a republic is a very hard thing to keep, right? As Franklin said, what type of government do we have? A republic, if we can keep it. And I think recent events have shown that that's not guaranteed. And so I would encourage us all to keep that in mind as we go into celebrate the best of the revolution. Please don't accuse me of being someone who isn't passionate about the American Revolution. I'm here for a reason, but I think we can keep that in mind.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much. We had 27 questions asked. I asked you maybe 3 or 4 of them. So we will,
my fault.
Everyone in the audience, we will be sending those along. Go buy the book, 40% off, free shipping.
Yes. Please also feel free to email me. It's Cole Jones, COLEJONES @purdue.edu. I'd be more than happy to talk to you and continue the dialogue.
Great. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you, guys.